Thank you very much, Irena. And I'd really like to thank Irena for inviting Fiona and I to this wonderful city and this fantastic medical school, which we can see has got an enormous amount of potential for the future. So I'm going to talk about my passion, which is qualitative research, and how it can be applied to randomized controlled trials. Now, you might think that these are two paradigms that are worlds apart, but I would argue that there is a paradigm shift in progress at the moment, and I'd like to acknowledge my colleagues, particularly Jenny Donovan and Alicia O'Cahorn. And we have funding through the Medical Research Council. We have a 5-year programme grant to look at qualitative research methods in randomised controlled trials, and that grant is held with the University of Bristol, and Jenny Donovan is the principal investigator on that. And I'm going to be referring to their work in this presentation. And I hope in this presentation that I'm going to convince you that we don't just need numbers, we need words. And the words help us to understand the meaning of the numbers. So what is qualitative research? It's scientific, it's a systematic approach that studies things and processes. So it understands behaviors, it understands meanings, beliefs, experiences, and produces insights into phenomena. And we do this through interviews, through documents, policies, for example, or through research diaries, and also through observations. And the observations can be very structured, or they can be like a fly on the wall, where nobody notices that you're there and you're observing everything that's going on. And particularly that fly-on-the-wall observation technique is very important for when a randomized controlled trial is being delivered. Because as a fly on the wall, you're not interfering with either of the intervention group or the control group, and it can provide an incredible amount of important information. So the essence of qualitative research is it's about written, spoken, but also non-verbal communication. So about rituals and practices and performances. The focus is on depth and detailed understanding. The reasoning is the exact opposite to a randomized controlled trial, which is deductive in its logic. You have a hypothesis, a null hypothesis, which you set out to test experimentally. With qualitative research, it's an inductive process. You're generating hypotheses, and the hypotheses emerge from your data collection and your data analysis, often in an iterative, cyclical process. And the sampling is small scale, so quite often your sample size will be 20 or 30, and it will be purposive. And the sampling strategy quite often changes as you're progressing with the study. As the research questions are generated and the hypotheses are generated, you change your sampling technique. So very different from a randomized controlled trial. So how is this relevant to clinical trials? Well, qualitative methods can reach the parts that other methods cannot reach. They address questions that are not so easily addressed by the quantitative methods, the numbers. What are the most relevant outcomes for patients? In clinical trials, we quite often choose the outcome to measure that the researchers think is most important. And increasingly in clinical trials, we're asking patients, what matters to you? What are the patient-reported outcomes that matter? PROMS is a common acronym for that. You can ask the question, why is our trial having difficulty recruiting patients? Or why is everybody dropping out of the trial after they've been recruited? Why have we got unexpected null results? Why hasn't the trial worked? These are all questions that are best addressed addressed through qualitative methods and understanding what's going on. So when do you conduct qualitative research? Well, you can start right at the very first idea phase for a trial. To actually, with a complex intervention, I'm not talking here about drug trials where you've got a drug and a placebo, I'm talking about more complex interventions. How do you decide which components are in your intervention? And how do you decide how those components are delivered? Who delivers them? Where are they delivered? How are they delivered? The timing. All of those questions can occur at the very first early stage and are appropriately answered by qualitative research. Then the usual process is that you do either a pilot trial, which is an exact replica of the trial that you intend to carry out, or you can do a feasibility trial where there's much more change as the feasibility trial progresses. And you can develop outcome measures using qualitative research and actually, something that I'll be talking about later, develop effective recruitment strategies. During the main trial, you need to know whether your intervention is being delivered per protocol, as you set out in the protocol. So that's known as intervention fidelity. You might also want to observe the interactions or find out if there's contamination between the intervention arm and the control arm. And then at the end of the trial, you might want to know how the trial is implemented into routine practice, or you might want to understand unexpected outcomes. So there's lots of potential there. And I would advocate mixed methods approaches and reflexivity about every single stage in trial design, right from the very beginning to the end. So those are my start flags. And I would say that a randomized controlled trial begins when you first start sharing the idea with other people, because the thinking of those people changes. So right from the very start. And the end is when that trial hopefully is implemented in practice. So perhaps the traditional model is to have the qualitative methods, the first row there, the qualitative methods at the design phase, quite separate from the randomized controlled trial, perhaps the fly on the wall, and then at the end explaining the outcomes. But there are other models that are developing. So, for example, you can have a trial, and quite often trialists think, oh, we need to find out why our trial isn't recruiting. We've got a problem here. Perhaps we'd better spend some money and bring in a team of qualitative researchers to find out what's going wrong. And that's a very common model. But the model that I would advocate, and which I use in my trials, is to have the randomized controlled trial embedded within qualitative research, so that I'm a qualitative researcher and I design trials. So I'm there right from the very beginning, interviewing, keeping a diary, observing, and I hope that I'll demonstrate to you later why that is so important. My colleague Alicia Cahorn has just recently published a couple of weeks ago a review of qualitative research in randomized controlled trials. When she started this review, she thought she would find about 50 papers. She found 296, and predominantly these were around the intervention, either the design of the intervention or the fidelity of the intervention. 15% were about the trial design and conduct. 5% were around developing outcome measures. Health conditions, so the experiences of patients about the condition that was under investigation, was 9%. And outcomes, which is the area that most interests me and which I talked about to the PhD students on Monday, was only 1%. There were only a couple of trials cited there. So this is an emerging area that we're interested in. So the opportunities for qualitative research in trials, they've got the potential to improve the design and conduct, and enabling potentially problematic trials to actually run, to improve recruitment or to optimize the design. They enhance, elaborate and clarify unusual trial findings. And mixed methods and a multidisciplinary team can add value because the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, and it enriches understanding for both the statisticians and the quantitative researchers and the qualitative researchers. But some of the pitfalls, and I've got some traffic lights up there in the corner. And one of the biggest pitfalls with qualitative research is asking people what they want. I don't know if anybody recognises that gentleman there. Does anybody recognise him? Somebody very famous American. It's Henry Ford who designed the first motor car. And he very famously said, if I'd asked people what they want, I would have designed a faster horse. And the danger with going to a small sample with qualitative research and asking 20 women what they would like as an intervention to improve breastfeeding rates is that you'll just produce more of the same. You won't be innovative and you won't think outside of the box. It's a real danger. The orange, focus groups, consensus methods, framing effects, so small-scale surveys. These are quite dangerous because at the design phase of a trial, you do not want consensus. You want maximum diversity. You want to troubleshoot the problems before they arise. And one of the big dangers is groupthink in trial design. We tend to go for systematic review evidence, and quite often you'll see that it's the same study, the same university, the same team, designing the same style of programs. We need to move away from that, particularly for the area that I'm interested in, which is lifestyle behavior change, breastfeeding, obesity, smoking cessation, where we haven't actually been that successful at designing high quality, effective trials. And then I would argue the philosophy of Karl Popper rather than the philosophy of Thomas Kuhn, because I do think that we need to move away from paradigms of randomized controlled trials, a paradigm of qualitative research, and that we need to be continually and deliberately trying to falsify the evidence that we've gathered. And so I've got my little black swan here, because Karl Popper famously said you need to go searching for the black swans. Do not assume that all swans are white. And this is so crucial in the early phases of trial design. And one strategy that we've been using quite successfully is around intervention vignettes. These are little scenarios of interventions that we think might show promise. And we talk through potential participants and health service staff. We talk through, it's almost like walking them through the journey of the trial to try and understand how they are thinking about it. It's a stage before doing the pilot. Obviously, the pilot is more robust because they're actually doing it and they're actually participating. But it's the first step in sort of simulating, if you like, the trial process. And we're having quite a lot of success, and I'm currently writing a paper about that at the moment. So I'm going to move on now to talk about some of my colleague Jenny Donovan's work. And she noticed that recruitment in trials was often slower and lower than anticipated, and that systematic reviews have really identified very few strategies on how you can improve recruitment to trials. Financial incentives tend to work, but only a very small effect, and not everybody can afford to give money to trial participants. And also it changes the whole meaning of participating in research if people only enter if they get paid for participating. Telephone reminders are often quite effective for collecting outcomes, and also making trial materials culturally sensitive. So Jenny Donovan published in the BMJ in 2002, and this really has to be considered the seminal work on qualitative research in randomized controlled trials. And she was involved in the PROTECT trial, which was an enormous randomized controlled trial of treatment, PSA testing for prostate cancer and treatment. And she audio recorded recruitment appointments with the doctors who were recruiting. So these were surgeons and some oncologists and radiotherapists. And what she found is that they were recruited, there were 3 arms in this trial. There was surgery, radiotherapy, and the control arm. And what she found from these recordings is that a large proportion of the time was spent talking about the surgery. And the doctors talked about the surgery very, very enthusiastically. They talked slightly less enthusiastically and for less time about the radiotherapy, but they hardly mentioned the control arm. And so as a result, this trial was failing to recruit because nobody wanted to be randomized. There wasn't equipoise. So they all wanted to say, oh, I'll have surgery, please. And she found that the doctors were very uncertain about explaining equipoise or uncertainty and the reason for doing the trial in the first place. And they were very uncertain and spent very little time talking about randomization and what that meant. And the patient said, well, they liked the surgery. And then the other arm, which they'd called watchful waiting in the information leaflet, the patients, when you interviewed them, said, well, it feels like they're waiting until I die. It feels like they're not doing anything, like I'm being neglected. And this was the key reason why they weren't successfully recruiting. It's a super study, by the way. I'd really encourage you to read it. So what Jenny and her team did is that they trained the recruiters to present the trial arms in a different order, so that you present the least popular arm first and the surgery last. And they changed the protocol to say that you need to spend equal time talking about each of these arms. And they renamed the control arm. They took away watchful waiting and called it active monitoring. Recruitment rates shot up and the trial was successful. And you'll still see trials reporting that use watchful waiting, which is, to me, quite remarkable. So they fed back to the recruiters to try and get this balance of the advantages and disadvantages of each of the arms. They avoided the loading terminology. And also they gave some training to the people recruiting to the trials to better explain the uncertainty, the equipoise that you need to conduct a randomized controlled trial. So just to summarize Jenny Donovan's work, what qualitative research methods can offer to recruitment, can help you to understand the recruitment processes. You understand by interviewing both the recruiters and the patients, you get to understand their different perspectives. You can record the consultations and observe them. And then you can feed this back to the chief investigator of a trial and the trial management team. And you can work with the chief investigators of the trial to improve recruitment through education and sharing experiences and to maintain it. So I'm now going to move on to another colleague's research. This is Bridget Young and her colleagues in the University of Liverpool, and she's also part of this MRC, Medical Research Council Methods Hub. And the UK Medicines for Children Research Network was established in 2005 to try and increase the quality and the number of randomized controlled trials for children. And Bridget Young and her colleagues have a specific area of work in this program, the RECRUIT study, which is now published, in +1, and it's using qualitative methods to investigate the recruitment into these Medicines for Children trials. And so the recruit study methods, they've got 4 clinical trials for really quite sick children: neonatology, respiratory, neurodevelopmental and rheumatology, and it's across 11 research sites. And they've audio recorded routine discussions between the paediatricians and the families. And they've done qualitative interviews with families and with the paediatricians, both the research nurses and the doctors. And they've focused on the look and the feel of these recruitment consultations, and they have gained family member and clinician perspectives. What they found is that in the recorded discussions, most of the talking was done by the doctors and the nurses recruiting. The parents asked very, very few questions. But the parents, when they were interviewed, said, well, doctors definitely should feel able to approach parents. They definitely think that. And parents were quite excited to be approached. And they would have been disappointed if the paediatricians hadn't asked them to be part of a trial. You don't want to think there's a trial that could improve your child's condition and your child hasn't been offered that. I would like to be asked. But in complete contrast, the clinicians saw the randomized controlled trial and informed consent as a legal procedure. And these were very sick children. And there was a lot of concern about adding a burden of a randomized controlled trial to these families that were already quite anxious and distressed by their child's illness. These are very sick kids, and this is yet another consideration for them. And they questioned the appropriateness of discussing research with these families. This family is at a terrible time, really. Is it right to be asking them to do this? And some clinicians were very apprehensive. I will go and approach them, but I feel very uncomfortable doing it every single time. And the conclusions and implications from this research was that despite saying little during child discussions, the parents had positive experiences of recruitment and did not object to being approached. However, the clinicians often saw this as a burden for the families, and some felt very anxious about it. And it was an arduous process for some clinicians, and that there was a real need to improve their experiences of recruiting and offering them training. And part of the training that was very valuable was to actually share the perspectives of the families of these children. So I'm now just going to talk about a little bit of my own research, which I apologize to the tribe students here because they've already seen this, but I hope it will be a bit of a refresher. And the big trial was a cluster randomized controlled trial of a policy to provide breastfeeding groups across Scotland. So this was quite unusual. It was a randomized controlled trial of a policy, and it was funded by the Scottish government because they weren't sure whether it was going to be worthwhile investing a lot of money in setting up new breastfeeding groups. And at the time, breastfeeding groups were being recommended by UNICEF Baby Friendly Accreditation Scheme. So the primary outcome, we're very fortunate to have excellent routinely collected data across Scotland for infant feeding outcomes. And so our primary outcome was feeding at 6 to 8 weeks. And we compared breastfeeding rates for 2 years before the policy was implemented and for 2 years after the policy was implemented. And we used prospective, embedded, mixed method case studies. So we started collecting qualitative data at the recruitment stage with the managers and the staff when we were recruiting the areas to participate in the trial. We collected quantitative data on the amount of group intervention we delivered, the frequency and the attendance rates at groups. We undertook qualitative interviews with a wide range of women, midwives, health professionals, managers. We observed some groups, and we also conducted serial interviews with key informants to find out what was going on in these geographical areas. And even at the recruitment stage, when we collected qualitative data from the staff that we were approaching to participate in this randomised controlled trial of the policy, we noticed quite different attitudes with the managers with the can-do type approach and the ones that were quite anxious and thought that maybe they didn't have sufficient resources. And we published a paper on this, recruitment, climbing mountains for the view at the top, or pushing boulders uphill. And what we found is that the quantitative data on attendance at breastfeeding groups didn't explain the trial outcomes, but the prospective model did. And by a prospective model, I'd like to emphasize that we wanted to minimize interpretation bias. So we constructed a model, an explanatory model that explained the outcomes before we knew the trial results. And we think that's very important. We think that actually knowing your trial results and then going and doing qualitative investigations to find out why the trial hadn't worked can be biased. And so we were able to understand why the breastfeeding rates increased in 3 areas, decreased in 3 areas, and stayed the same in 1 area. And we were also able to explain why the pilot study worked in one area, but not in the trial. And this was our model, and I'm not going to go into this in detail. The tribe students have already heard quite a lot about this, and their slides are available from that presentation. But basically what was quite crucial was the top diagonal, the triangle. So the leadership that actually facilitated multidisciplinary partnership working in the areas and reflective action cycles. And the 3 areas where breastfeeding rates increased, they reached this, the successful breastfeeding groups, and breastfeeding rates went up. In the areas where breastfeeding rates went down, the management were dealing all the time with problems at these base levels. And one of the biggest problems were the places where the breastfeeding groups were being held, because they were often not very friendly for breastfeeding women. They were cold, uncomfortable chairs, or they were too far away for the midwives and professionals to attend. I'm not going to spend any more time on that. So, just to sum up, qualitative research is a systematic approach and can contribute to a mixed methods approach to gain multiple perspectives on randomized controlled trials. It's relevant right from the very initial design phase and to the trial outcomes. That it's important for statisticians, quantitative researchers and qualitative researchers to respect each other, to ensure rigor really in the methodological approach, to make sure that the qualitative research doesn't interfere in any way with the trial rigor, but can contribute maximally to understanding what is going on with the trial. So this idea of reflexivity, of actually, we say in English, washing your dirty laundry in public, actually being much more transparent about what's going wrong in the trials that have problems, and find out why it's going wrong so that we're not repeating the same mistakes and having null trial after null trial. And I would advocate that there is a new discipline emerging, and I would call myself a qualitative trialist or a qualitative interventionist, and that we're designing more ethnographic observational trials. And the little toolbox at the bottom there is my approach to methods, is that you constantly pose the research questions that matter, and you choose the methodological tool from your box that will best answer that question. So just a concluding thought here. Mixing methods offers enormous potential for exploring new dimensions of experience and intersections between these. It can encourage researchers to see differently or to think outside the box if they are willing to approach research problems with an innovative and creative palette of methods of data generation. Thank you.